God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son whom you love. It's interesting that all of that is emphasized in the text. And go to Mount Moriah and make of him a sacrifice unto me. And Abraham saddles his horse, takes a servant, doesn't tell his wife, takes his son Isaac. They travel for 2 days. Isaac asks at a certain point, where are we going? His father says, we're going to sacrifice. He says, well, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will provide the sacrifice. They go up to Mount Moriah, and as everyone knows, as Abraham is about to slaughter Isaac, he binds him, he prepares him, he's about to slaughter him, and God intervenes, and instead of Isaac, points to a lamb in the bush that he can sacrifice instead. Now, as you can imagine, theologians and philosophers have had a tremendously difficult time with that story, and there are all kinds of answers. Perhaps the most famous one is Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard says people pay lip service to this story all the time and say, isn't Abraham wonderful? He's a model of faith. But nobody's stopping and really thinking about what the story is. The story is the story of something appalling. And isn't Abraham just doing something absolutely terrible? That's the challenge Kierkegaard sets himself, is to think, can we understand Abraham so that we can see the value of his commitment rather than just write him off as a murderer, as a lunatic?
Immanuel Kant, the great defender of human reason and the person who said that our practical reason is, for all intents and purposes, the same kind of reason that God has, said that Abraham was wrong. Abraham should have told God no. Now, it's, you might say, a gigantic act of hubris, but Kant's entire philosophy is based on the claim that one has to think for themselves, and that if you hear a voice telling you to slaughter your son, you better think that that can't possibly be God.
What Kierkegaard talked about was the newspaper. Everybody wakes up in the morning and reads the newspaper. This was, to his mind, terribly superficial. Think of what he would have said about commercial television and the internet. I mean, we're constantly surfing and flipping through and taking a quick look and dropping things and never having a kind of center of gravity about what's most deeply important to us. So Kierkegaard thought that Christianity was giving you this model of absolute focused, caring commitment, and that modern society was deeply hostile to these kinds of commitments. And that's, I think, a shrewd insight, and one can accept a lot of it without necessarily accepting that Christianity is the kind of caring commitment that you ought to have. It's not hard to take Kierkegaard's story and, in a way, secularize it to any number of different kinds of strong, caring commitments as a way of focusing life and resisting this sort of banalizing leveling. What Kierkegaard called the leveling process was assimilating everything, digesting it, throwing it away, and never finding one's center of gravity in something most worth living and even dying for.
But isn't that what we're most terrified of, actually? Is people feel so strongly about stuff.
Right. Well, what one starts to worry about is whether this kind of strong, focused, caring commitment or faith might start to look like fanaticism. It might look like an irrationality, irrational commitment to something without being critical and reflective about it in the proper way. So there is an important question, a worrying question about how you distinguish loving something wholeheartedly, from being irrationally devoted to a cause, say, or a goal or a project, and becoming a fanatic about it. One thing that creates conflict in life, and I think conflict is inevitable in life, but one thing that creates unnecessary, enduring conflict among people is an inability to imagine themselves into each other's perspective and to understand the goods that another person is embracing or living for or fighting for. So I think there's an enormous task of imagination, stretching our imaginations to try to understand the point of view of the other, and that can potentially defuse a lot of unnecessary conflict and hatred. I don't think it's ever going to get rid of it, because I think it's in the nature of goods that they be incompatible and at odds with each other. But I think that one thing that separates people is just the difficulty of letting go or suspending your own deep values and commitments in order to imagine your way into a very different way of perceiving the world. So I think that work of imagination is absolutely crucial to allowing us to live together without just being at each other's throats.